This video is going to be a basic introduction into Graphene single sign-on, specifically the way you configure Graphene with CAS, and the multiple different ways that we can actually do that. So I'm sitting here looking at the Graphene administrative menu, specifically the CAS menu within the Sites tab. So click on Sites here, go to the only site we have set up, and you'll notice that one of the first things I've already done is I've changed the authentication type from default, which is the basic built-in Graphene authentication type, and I've switched that over to CAS. So now when I hop up into the CAS tab, we've got some stuff in here which we can do things with. So the first thing that we're going to want to take a look at is the CAS host name, actually a few of these things together, because you'll notice that I haven't actually defined the full CAS login and logout URL, and the reason that I haven't done that is because these first few fields, when combined together, Graphene does some basic interpolation and can kind of guess what your CAS login and logout URLs are going to look like. So fundamentally here, we've got the URL, securetest.binghamton.edu /CAS, and then /login is what the login URL is applied to be, and the logout URL depending on your particular configuration. But by default, those are kind of assumed. So if I go to the basic CAS login here, this is securetest.binghamton.edu. We're running with HTTPS on port 443 and /CAS/login. That's my basic CAS authentication. And because we haven't deviated from the defaults with that too much, this information here above is sufficient to make that stuff work correctly. We don't need to fill out the rest of these fields. So these next two fields are pretty important though, right? So CAS enable SAML. CAS actually has the ability to operate in two fundamentally different modes. The first one is the classic CAS authentication, where upon successful authentication, the application that's trying to authenticate just gets back the username of the person who authenticated. So in my case, that would just be T. Cortese. And so it's not giving you any additional fields. You're not getting first name, last name. You're not getting email address. You're really just getting that one field. And because of that, we have the other option here of looking up additional fields from some external data source. So we can use those two things together to get additional data if we want to. For the sake of this demonstration, or this initial demonstration, I have that disabled. When we enable CAS with SAML, however, then we actually can get back some additional attributes about that user, which are above and beyond just the username. But for this first demonstration, I'm going to disable SAML, and I'm going to disable that external lookup. And so what we have here, starting with the bottom, going up, we have the unique identifier. And so these four fields are actually really important to Graphene. They can't be blank, and they need to be populated with something. But since the only thing that we have available to us is the username, we're going to populate the unique ID, of course, with the username. Now, jumping back up to the email address, we're going to cheat a little bit here, and we're going to say, okay, well, the email address is really just the username concatenated to @binghamton.edu in my case. So we're going to use a little bit of basic mustache syntax, and that's what the curly braces are here. And we're going to concatenate together those two fields, and that's how we're going to get the email address. Now for the first name and last name, again, since we don't really have that information, we're just going to say username, username all across the way. So we're going to map this information to a user. It's going to be kind of wrong, but it's going to work based on what our needs are here today. So let's give that a try. All right, so here I am in a incognito window, and you'll notice that we're at the CAS login page. So I'm going to type in my credentials here. All right, so we've authenticated successfully. You'll notice here that my first name and last name are now set to T. Cortese and T. Cortese. And if we pop over to our database here and refresh, you'll notice that it actually created an entirely new user. The unique ID is T. Cortese. As I said before, the first name and last name are also T. Cortese. But it did actually figure out what my email address was correctly, tcortese@binghamton.edu, by concatenating those two fields together. So that's reasonably straightforward. But for this example, that's not really all that helpful, because we really want to be able to get back first name and last name, and potentially our email address might be something a little bit different than the first name, or the username rather, concatenated to @binghamton.edu. So what we're going to do next is we're going to try this external user lookup enabled field, where we're actually going to query another data source with the information that we have and try to get back some additional fields that are available. So I've got here another data source. This is this is a basic API. It's actually a public API where when I pass it, here I'll do this, username equals tcortese. When I pass it a username, it gives me back the Spreiden last name, Spreiden first name, which is the first and last name, this unique identifier field, and also this email address field. So we're going to call this API. We're going to copy and paste this thing here. So we're going to put that over here, and we'll enable this and say, okay, so we're going to put this in here, and we're going to use the this get verb, right? So we have the option of doing a get or a post. In this sake, we're going to use the get verb. Okay, so we're going to go to those two APIs, and what this is going to automatically do is it's going to send that external API whatever information we have available to us right now. And right now, really the only information we have available to us is the username. So it's going to do pretty much the same request that I just did here, where it's going to send the username, and it's going to hopefully pull back an object with some additional information in it. Now, because of that, when we map these fields down here, instead of just putting username across the entire thing, we can actually reference these directly. So let's go ahead and do email address just like this. So instead of all that stuff, we're going to do this. And for last name, we're going to do last name. And for first name, we're going to do first name. Okay. Our unique ID is still going to be that internal unique ID that came back from CAS, but these other fields are going to be pulled from that external data source. All right, so let's save that, and let's go back to our incognito window, and we're going to log out, and we're going to log back in again. All right. So we're back at CAS. And here we go. So you'll notice that now I'm getting back my full first name and last name. And if we hop back over to our database again and refresh, you'll notice that we're actually getting the email address from that external data source, as well as the first name and the last name. So that's actually pretty neat because we're able to get some additional information that we would not have been able to get before. Also, just as an additional mention here, it is important to note that if for some reason this external API were down for some reason, because we've got some data in our database already, it's not going to overwrite that with nothing. So this does give you some reasonable amount of fault tolerance here in that it will allow you to pull back some fields, assuming the API is up, and if the API is down for some reason, you're still good to go because we're not because we're not necessarily relying on that API for absolutely everything. Okay, so we've gotten that information, but let's try to see. Let's go ahead and look at this CAS data map here because this actually allows us to pull some additional information that's not necessarily part of these first four fields that are built into Graphene. So, for example, this API it gives me those four fields, but let's say that I wanted to remap the Spreiden ID to the internal name that we used at Binghamton University. And so I'm just going to call that B number. So we can do that here. And we can say, okay, I want the Spreiden ID to be equal to the Spreiden ID. So here, oops, we'll copy that again. And that's going to be our Spreiden ID. And so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to be able to pull back that additional field, and we're going to be able to map it as an additional attribute that then becomes available as part of that user object. So let's go ahead and save that again, and let's log out and log back in again. Let's log back in again. Okay, so we successfully authenticated. Not a whole lot of change here, but again, if we go look at our database, you'll notice that over here under additional parameters, we now have available to us that B number field. So you can imagine that depending on what the fields are that you have available to you, you could actually map a whole bunch of additional attributes to a particular user, and that actually becomes very useful when you're developing these micro applications later. So that's really it. That's as much as we can do without enabling SAML. So let's go ahead and try out SAML as well. So we're going to enable that. Now, just to explain how SAML works, I've got an example here. This is a basic CAS client, and all this thing actually does is, here, we'll log out and log back in again. So this is a basic CAS client, and all it does upon a successful authentication is it just prints out all of the different attributes that are available to us from CAS. And you'll notice here that we've got first name, last name, some of the information, but we've also got a whole bunch of other information as well. So I'm going to, rather than trying to pull the things like first name, last name, and that other stuff from that external API, so we'll get rid of external lookup enable. We'll turn that off. And we're going to go ahead and enable SAML. Here we go. But now because we're not getting fields from this API, we're actually getting them from CAS, we need to change how we're mapping those things. So here, first name is just called first name. So let's change that. Let's see, it looks like last name is actually called last name, so we'll use that. What else do we have available to us? That B number field that we had here is now actually called UDC identifier, so we're going to put that down here. And let's see, what about email address? Email is just called mail. So now we're actually getting all of the same information that we were getting before, except rather than having to rely on that external user lookup, we're getting all of that information right here directly from the CAS server itself, of course, using SAML enabled. So let's go ahead and save this. And actually, just to show that we're actually doing something different, I'm going to concatenate the word new to first name just so that we can see that we actually did get something different and we're not just because otherwise really nothing's going to change here. So let's save that and let's go back over here and let's log out and log back in again. Okay. And we've logged in. Uh-oh, looks like we got an authentication error here. Okay, so unable to authenticate user, unique ID cannot be determined. So let's go here and see what's going on with the unique identifier. Ah, yes. So when we switch from SAML that wasn't, or rather when we switched from CAS disabled SAML to CAS enabled SAML, we actually lost our username field because that's not coming back anymore. So let's see what that's mapped to. So that's actually SA, that's this whole thing here. So let's grab that and let's fix that. Okay, so that should fix our username field because of course that's now coming back with a different name. And let's try this one more time. All we should have to do is refresh this page. Also, you'll notice here, this is a little bit of a secret hidden thing within Graphene that's kind of useful for debugging purposes. If you ever get an error like this, and you can actually click on the message and it'll expand and give you a whole stack dump, which can be helpful for debugging, and that's how I was able to get some more information. But let's just go ahead and refresh, and this time it should work correctly. And of course, up here, we had the first name, and that's been concatenated to new, and then the last name. So that actually worked correctly. So that really shows a couple different ways that we can use CAS. We can have CAS just by itself, which works, but of course that's not the perfect solution because you don't get other additional attributes. So of course you can use CAS without SAML, but using that additional user lookup, which you can get some more information from, or we can use entirely SAML and get some more information that way. And then of course the last thing we could do if we wanted to is we could actually do both, where we could use SAML and then we could also look up additional attributes from some other data source. In this case, there's really no other information at this API, so showing you that wouldn't really do a whole lot extra, but that would be possible as well. One last thing that I do want to point out, however, is that if we're using CAS and we're using it without SAML, it is entirely possible if we're using it without SAML and we are using that additional user lookup information, we could theoretically use, for example, this Spriden ID here or this email address as the unique identifier down here with Graphene. The concern with doing that, however, is that now we are assuming that anytime a user is logging into Graphene, that this API must be up. It absolutely has to be up. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to authenticate the user correctly. So that really kind of becomes a consideration because now CAS has to be up, but also this external lookup has to be up, and that can be potentially a little bit limiting for certain situations. So I'll turn that off. So that's something that you might want to consider. If you do actually want to have a unique identifier that's maybe not username exposed via CAS, the best way to do that is really to expose it via the SAML integration, just because the username field, while that may be unique, if it's not unique in all cases, really exposing additional attributes via SAML is kind of the best way to go. So that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.